Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk for a Friday Mailbag special. This is a show where we talk general aviation for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott, and each week I hear from many of you, and these are some of your emails. By the way, if I sound a little different, it's because I'm recording this from a hotel in Burbank, California, because in the morning I depart on a trip in a Vision Jet back to Knoxville, and I'll tell you more about that in a future episode. We have a great collection of emails from you today. Several of them are in response to episode 263, in which we explore the technology and performance of the Diamond DA42 with author John Ewing. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/263. Here's our first email. It comes from Tom Turner. He's a CFI that we've had on the show before. He says, "Hi Max, great discussion with John Ewing on operations and training techniques in the Diamond DA42. I've been enamored by the type since it was first introduced, although I have yet had the opportunity to fly one. The amazing yet unconventional engine and engine-out training requirements require a lot of training for the instructors as well. Since you instruct in the Diamond Twin yourself, I'd be interested to hear you follow up by discussing two things. With the growing prevalence of the DA42 in training organizations, one, what do you think it would take to transition a pilot trained in a Diamond DA42 into a traditional piston twin? And two, can an instructor who earned his or her multi-engine rating in MEI in a DA42 be reasonably able to teach in a conventional piston twin with only the minimum required 5 hours PIC before teaching toward a certificate or rating, let alone conducting flight reviews and IPCs, which require no prior time and type? Thanks as always for the outstanding podcast." Well, Tom, I wanted to get an even better answer than I could provide, so I turned to John Ewing, who's got more than 1,000 hours, considerably more than I do in the DA42, and he answered your questions. He wrote back, "Hi Max, good questions. Regarding number one, a pilot transitioning to any multi-engine aircraft will need to show proficiency in the operation of the aircraft systems. There will be some negative transfers from a DA42-62 to a Baron or Seminole. A few things that come to mind: engine shutdown and restart, as well as engine management, i.e. prop, manifold pressure settings, and leading procedures. Fuel systems also tend to vary between aircraft types and need to be well understood. Seems to me that adequate transition training must take into account all of the AMEL tasks common to the private or commercial pilot ACS. And regarding number two, obviously the minimum 5 hours in type may not be enough to prepare an instructor to be competent in providing instruction in a Diamond DA42 or 62. Same holds true for DPEs too, by the way. The best way to transition to the DA42 or 62 would be to obtain formal training from an instructor or flight school with experience in those types. When I trained pilots and instructors at Angel City Flyers in Long Beach and Bay City Flyers, now defunct, in Hayward, California, we had a 6-hour ground training program, a PowerPoint, covering the theory and operation of all the aircraft systems. There was a short test that needed to be successfully completed after each section of ground training. Only after that ground training was successfully completed would the flight training in the aircraft begin. The model was similar to training for a type rating in a turbojet aircraft, and that model proved to be time and money efficient and resulted in pilots who were competent and proficient in operating the aircraft and its systems." John, thanks so much for providing that reply. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Russ Irwin, who I know has a DA62 that will deliver in the next month or so. We've flown together in the Diamond DA42, and he says, "A couple of follow-up points on the Diamond DA42 interview and a bit of nitpicking. One, John mentioned the ability to cut the power and establish a high descent rate. What he didn't mention, which I think is important to your listeners who might rent a DA42, is that if you do that at higher altitudes, even though you pull the power levers to 0%, the engines will not go to 0% to prevent combustion extinction," in quotes. Below is the explanation and chart from the Astro Engines operation manual. I, of course, learned of this the hard way, pulling the power at 12,500 feet and watching the engines only drop to about 27%. I assumed there was a problem with the ECUs, that's the engine control units, and began thinking about when I would turn off the engine master on final approach. Of course, as I descended, the engine power dropped and it was a non-issue. However, neither my mechanic or the Diamond support person with whom I spoke while on the ground at Fox Field in Southern California knew about this behavior. Another owner later educated me. 2, you'd ask about feathering, and John explained the auto feather and simulated engine out. He didn't mention that the maximum pitch is attained when the power lever is at 20%. This is one reason simulating power out at 20% is useful. It's also very relevant to a DA40NG with an engine failure. If the ECUs are still working, putting the power lever at 20% will reduce drag and maximize glide. I have this position marked with a piece of tape in my DA40NG, and with the power at 0%, there is noticeable and substantial drag from the propeller. And number 3, John suggested it was a 2 to 3 passenger airplane. With full tanks, good for 3 hours with a 45-minute reserve, there was 806 pounds of remaining useful load. That makes it a real 4-passenger plane. It would accommodate 2 couples averaging 175 pounds with 100 pounds of luggage. Also, he said it trued out at about 145 knots, though I recall John mentioning 2 different airspeeds, and that was the slower of them. Yes, I thought that was a little slow based on what I've seen in the Diamond. Anyway, he continues, cruising at 75% and 10,000 feet on trips over 2 hours. I'm generally at 10,000 to 14,000 feet. It is cruising at 165 knots true. I've always run my engine at 85% in cruise, though I know people who run their DA40NG or DA42NG-6 at 92% power. At 85%, it will be north of 170 knots while burning 15 gallons per hour. And then on a separate topic, he says, since you teach in the Diamond DA42, I thought you might find this interesting. This has been discussed in the Diamond forums, but the official report was just released. And what he's referring to is the report on a DA42 accident that occurred in Norway back in November of 2021. And I have a separate email that came from patron supporter Trevor Moody talking about the same accident. He wrote, "Hi Max, in case you haven't seen it, here's a detailed final report on the 3 fatal Norwegian training accident in November 2021. It certainly points to an unrecoverable spin, though it is inconclusive. Of interest is 2 anonymous reports of spins occurring during previous training flights, in both cases as a result of practicing engine failure during a simulated go-around at altitude. Although it's only 2 data points, the fatal Norwegian accident and one of the anonymous Swedish spins had a third person in the back. In the case of the Swedish spin, the instructor reported that spin recovery with the third person in the back was very difficult. The spin started at 7,400 feet MSL and was recovered at 800 feet MSL. Wow, that's a long time to recover from a spin." He continues, "So while you certainly never want to get into a spin in a DA42, not surprising, you definitely don't want to do it with someone in the rear seats. Probably the case for any light twin, but a good reminder. And I'm pretty sure it's illegal to spin a Diamond DA42, so whoever was doing that, wow. they certainly weren't following the rules." I pulled up the report. I'll include a link to it in the show notes. And just to read briefly from this accident report from Norway, it says, on Tuesday, the 23rd of November of 2021, the airplane, Lima November Papa Foxtrot Mike, went out of control and crashed in hilly woodlands in the Larvik community of Norway. All 3 on board died instantly. The accident occurred during instructions on multi-engine piston aircraft. A student from Pilot Flight Academy had his first instructional flight in a twin-engine DA42 NG-type airplane. Airwork training was conducted at an altitude of about 3,600 feet above ground level in the training area. Besides the instructor and the student, a fellow student was seated in the back seat. Approximately 32 minutes into the flight, while practicing slow flight with the landing gear and flaps extended, the airplane went out of control and spun into the ground. The NSIA, which I think is the investigation agency in Norway, has investigated several possible scenarios, but it has not been possible to establish an unequivocal explanation as to why the airplane went out of control and started to spin. Like other multi-engine aircraft, this aircraft type is not approved for spins. In general, multi-engine aircraft could be difficult to get out of a spin if they inadvertently entered a spin. A review of slow flight sequences and stalling exercises, and this was a review of other aircraft in the fleet for their past flights, did not reveal any situations that contribute to explaining what happened with LN-PFM. For example, the NSIA did not find any stalls that had resulted in significant wing drop or other unusual attitudes. The speed was sometimes as low as 65 knots before normal flight was resumed. And I'll just say that's pretty slow. I do slow flight in the DA42NG at 75 knots. And in conclusion, the report says, quote, during slow flight training with the landing gear and flaps deployed in a landing configuration at an altitude of approximately 3,600 feet AGL, control of the airplane was lost and it spun to the ground. The NSIA has had limited access to information and it has not been possible to establish unequivocally why control of the airplane was lost and could not be regained in time to prevent the accident. And here's an email from patron supporter Forrest Jesperson. He writes, "Hello, Max. As with many of your supporters, I've been gleaning innumerable tips and learning points from you for a long time. It's a long time since I corrected, so I became a monthly supporter and also made a one-time donation to make up for the past. Thank you for your dedication to GA safety and education. I received my private in June 2021, and though I'm not flying with a CFI as often as I would like, I feel that my education and competence as a pilot continues to grow due to your content. I thought I'd also share a safety practice that my favorite CFI drilled into me that also causes a bit of a chuckle. When holding short of the departing runway, I always review the things that are going to FFACC me." And he says that's pronounced kind of like the F word. He said this stands for F for fuel. The fuel selector is appropriately set, and I verify the gauges indicate full fuel. The second F for fire. The mags are on both. A for airspeed. The pitot cover has been removed, so I should anticipate seeing airspeed come alive. C for configuration. The takeoff configuration is correct for the given conditions, i.e. short field, soft field flaps, etc. And the last C for confirmation. I've been cleared for takeoff by ATC and or have verified it's safe to proceed onto the runway if at a non-towered airport. After listening to the issues with seat rails giving way on takeoff, which we talked about in prior shows, I'm thinking to amend this by adding an S at the end for seat rails and push down on the adjustment lever once more to make sure the pins are down. Thank you again. I look forward to many more Trescott teachings in the future. Best, Forrest. Forrest, thanks so much for your email and for supporting the show. And here's a comment that came on through YouTube from a recent episode. It's from Kilted Piper. He wrote, "Another great episode. You just keep knocking it out of the park, Max. I just heard Tom," that's referring to Tom Turner, who we had a recent show, on the Sporties podcast. A good episode as well. So awesome that he can cover topics so relevant to the flying I am doing in ways that really help improve safety. I had a friend flying an A36 when he lost a cylinder. He chose to continue back to the home airport instead of stopping at a closer airport with maintenance. Luckily, it ended well for both and his airplane. However, as I think back on that, I would have turned around and landed at a closer airport. Thanks for showing the data to help reinforce this. And that's where we talked about how partial engine failures are 3 times as likely as full, complete engine failures. Yes, and this reminds me of one of the 2 times that I had reduced engine power, and it just occurred basically in cruise that it dropped down to around 2,000 RPM in an older Cessna 172. I had already passed the San Martin airport and was probably within 10 miles of my then home airport, the Reed Hillview Airport. And what I thought about was, gee, if I lose additional power and I continue in this direction, I'm going to be over a populated area. Better to make an immediate turn back to the airport that I just passed, put it down there and have a mechanic take a look at it, which is exactly what we did. And here's the email from Seth Meriwether regarding CO poisoning. He says, "I'm an avid listener and have been for quite some time. You've helped me pass my instrument and commercial check rides. I'm currently 27, working on my CFI and II, and had a first-time experience that I thought you might find useful to share. I was planning to take my father and friend to the airport with the intention of enjoying a scenic flight and intro to GA. We completed an extensive pre-flight discussing the functionality of the aircraft and its components. I showed him how to pre-flight. We spent probably 30 minutes walking around discussing different risk-related elements and general scenarios that could ruin your day. When it comes to pre-flighting, I'd rather have my day ruined on the ground than in the air. I'm looking for a reason not to go flying. On this well-loved 1973 PA-28-180, the top cowling is one large piece, a bit of a headache to take off and get realigned again. That being said, we did not take the entire top half of the cowling off on this particular flight. Why? Great question, and I'm going to defer to complacency. We proceeded to thoroughly look past the spinner and prop and in through the oil filler door and noticed nothing unusual. I made a point to feel for the alternator belt, check that the starter is disengaged, and verify that the hose for the air inlet was not detached or collapsed due to the metal wire unraveling. Everything looked normal, so we proceeded on board, started up, and taxied. During the run-up, after reaching 2,000 RPM with 15 seconds, a high-pitched alarm that I had never heard before sounded. I have about 50 hours in this exact plane, and I know it well, which made me feel uncomfortable saying out loud, I have no idea what that is. After looking around for things I knew it wasn't, I looked at ForeFlight on my iPad. It was my incredibly loud Sentry Puck, which was showing some rather worrying text CO 200 ppm, that would be carbon monoxide, which I knew couldn't be good because it was written in red. My immediate thought was to open the door, which we did, and then to check the cabin heat switch. It was in the on position. I U-turned, shut down, and then I wondered if it could have been a false reading due to the cabin heat vent being open, lack of ventilation on the ground, causing a buildup of CO. Amazing the things we start to think to prove ourselves or equipment wrong sometimes. I wasn't trying to talk myself into flying, but just curious how we got such a spike in CO levels so quickly. I called the flight school I rented from, and the plane was immediately grounded. A few days later, I reached out to the school to ask if there was an update, and was informed that a hose clamp had come loose on the heater ducting, and the hose fell off. We really did have the perfect storm. The cabin heat vent was left open from a prior flight with a disconnected hose that allowed enough of a CO buildup within 7 minutes to set off my CO alarm on my Sentry while we were still on the ground. I just thought, what if the vent had been closed like it always was? We wouldn't have had the same problem, but probably a much slower leak, allowing us to taxi, take off, and get away from an airport before the alarm would have sounded. I wanted to share this for two reasons. One, because you know that most GA planes have zero or terrible systems in place to detect carbon monoxide unless you carry a monitor. That little piece of white plastic with the orange dot on it, please, that's very ineffective, and we've talked about that in the past. Carbon monoxide is a silent killer, and without a sensor, you are strictly asking your body to present side effects which can be written off as innumerable things prior to realizing what it could actually be, and then it may be too late. 2, buy a Sentry, buy a sensor, buy a wall-mounted CO detector, and pop it in the airplane. Have all the tools in your tool belt to give you the edge to increase safety before you ever leave the ground. I hate to think an accident could have been avoided by having one small piece of relatively inexpensive, in the grand scheme of flight training, equipment. Mine just paid for itself this past weekend. Max, thanks for all that you do. Keep the shiny side up. Cheers, Seth. And we talked about carbon monoxide at length in 2 prior episodes. It was almost 4 years ago, so if you haven't heard them, or it was a long time ago since you heard them, you may want to check them out again. Episode 88, 4 Things You Should Know About Carbon Monoxide. And episode 90, Mooney pilot passes out from CO poisoning and survives. You can find both episodes at aviationnewstalk.com/88 and /90. And here's an email from a new Patreon supporter, Greg Batla. He writes, "Hey Max, been enjoying your podcast now for a couple of years and finally joined as a long overdue supporter. I recently finished my private, and I believe your podcast has made me a safer pilot. I admit your show does scare the crap out of me, as every episode seems to uncover yet another way to die in a small airplane. But I'm hopeful that if I internalize the info, one of the lessons learned could save me, or more importantly, my family's lives one day. Thanks so much for all you do to help keep us safe. I did want to share something kind of fun. ChatGPT seems to be the talk of the town these days, so I tried my hand at it with a question: what are the top 10 ways to not die while flying a small airplane? This is what it spit out. Not revolutionary, but definitely 10 good items to keep in mind. And I'll just read the first few words of each of these 10 items, not the full sentences that go with them. But number 1, get proper training. 2, check weather conditions. 3, conduct pre-flight inspections. 4, plan your route. 5, use a checklist. 6, communicate with ATC. 7, avoid overloading the aircraft. 8, maintain proper altitude. 9, keep a watchful eye on fuel levels. And 10, stay calm and focused. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Ryan Dlugash, who's a flight instructor in the Washington, D.C. area. He says, "Hi again, Max. I meant to write in when you were talking about headlamps and red lights in the cockpit. I must admit I don't remember if you advocated for red lights or just dim white, but your listener feedback in episode 262 recommending a headlamp with dim red light makes me think it would be beneficial to send you this article I wrote a little while ago. I send it to anyone who mentions red light for cockpit lighting. Hopefully it's not too dry reading, but the bottom line is I strongly advocate for the use of white lights and not red while flying." And that article can be found at cfi.tips/red. He says, "Thanks as always." By the way, I did talk in detail about various cockpit headlamps that you can buy. I bought about a half a dozen of them and tested them back in episode 57. And as I recall, I found research, which I talked about on the show, that said 2 Air Force ophthalmologists recommended dim white light and 1 recommended blue light. So they couldn't all agree, but none of them recommended red light. And here's an email from patron mega supporter Lars Sorsdal, who's from Norway. "Hi, Max. Over the last couple of years, I listened to all of the Aviation News Talk episodes, back to the very first one. Listening to the Impossible Turn episode brought back many memories and emotions from when I had to make a split-second decision between following the urge to get back to the airport or follow the training by landing straight ahead. Luckily, I chose the latter option. The Cherokee I was going to fly was notoriously difficult to start in wintertime. This day was no exception. My primary flight instructor and I, who were going to do the same flight with another airplane, were unable to start the engine. After getting help from a mechanic and a battery cart, we finally managed to get the engine running. Even though I was alone in the plane, I did my departure briefing talking out loud to myself. Just thinking about the plan to handle emergencies makes it too easy to skip some or all steps, so I always say my departure briefing out loud. Everything seemed normal when I advanced the throttle. Sound, acceleration, and initial climb seemed normal. The only thing I noticed was a better than normal rate of climb due to the cold air. At about 150 feet AGL, everything changed. Actually, only one thing changed. The RPM of the engine dropped significantly, and it gave me literally a sinking feeling in my stomach. I lowered the nose to maintain my airspeed and started to go through the emergency checklist, but when I looked out the window, again I realized that I needed to make a decision. Should I continue, or should I attempt to land? Usually I enjoy looking down on the Norwegian landscape, but in that situation looking out was scary. River, trees, and hills all around me, except for that snow-covered field just in front of me. It seemed like I had only one chance, and I didn't hesitate to act. It felt like the engine lost about 50% of the power, and that the aircraft did not have enough power to climb. Turning around was not an option, and there was no time to figure out what the problem was if I wanted to land in the field ahead. I pulled the throttle back to idle, pitched down, set full flaps, and broadcast a short Mayday message to tower before turning slightly to the left so that I was aligned with the full length of the field. I tried to keep my wings level and touch down at the lowest possible speed, but it was difficult to see the contours of the snow-covered ground. The landing was quite soft until the right wingtip became submerged in the snow. The aircraft did an abrupt 90-degree turn and came to rest. Stopping distance was measured to be 61 meters from the first point of contact with the snow. At the time, the field was covered with 35 centimeters of snow, which would be about almost 14 inches. Would I make the same decision again? The answer was yes. With a partial engine failure at that altitude, there were really no other good options to choose from. And SHT, the Norwegian version of the NTSB, stated in the report regarding my emergency landing that 2 of the spark plugs in one of the cylinders were covered by soot. SHT did not reach any conclusion about why the spark plugs in a single cylinder were covered by soot. I would assume that any faulty spark plug would be noticeable during the mag check during run-up, but nothing seemed to be wrong at that point in time. Going from 4 to 3 cylinders would result in substantial decrease in power, since the cylinder then changes from producing 25% power to only creating resistance. And now let me invite you to send me your feedback and emails. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page, and I'll try to read them on the show. And if you'd like to record a short message of 90 seconds or less, go to the same email address and click on Listener Questions at the top of the page. And here's a review that someone put into the iTunes Apple podcast player. They wrote, Best Aviation Podcast. This was written by ClearProp177. This podcast is fantastic, fresh and relevant aviation content, an excellent guest. I always learn something from each episode. Top-notch production as well. Keep up the great work. Well, thanks so much for that review. And if you have a free moment, please go ahead and leave a 5-star review for Aviation News Talk in whatever app that you use to listen to me. That way other people may be influenced by your recommendation to give us a listen. Speaking of listening, this is a listener-supported show, and we're still ad-free. So if you've been enjoying Aviation News Talk and you've learned something from it, please take the 2 or 3 minutes it takes to become a member and join the club to support Aviation News Talk. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And of course, there's a link for that website in our show notes. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blues side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until your side's baby sliding upside down.